Hey guys, today we'll be replacing the starter on this 2007 328i. It's an E90 and this is the N54 engine. This past weekend it was insanely cold. It was about 2 degrees outside. I went out to start my car and it wouldn't turn over. I tried to start it one more time and it wouldn't start. It didn't make any noise at all. I tested the battery. It was a good battery. It had good cranking amps and it wasn't the issue. So here we are replacing the starter. I had to push and tow my car into the garage here. Trust me, it was Before touching anything here in the engine bay, we need to head over to the trunk and disconnect the battery. The battery is located under this cover here in the right side of the trunk. Using a 10mm socket, I'm going to disconnect the negative lead back here and I'm going to isolate it using a cloth. Here's what I mean by isolating the battery lead. I just placed a cloth in between the battery and the lead, and I'm just leaving the lead resting on top of it. This should prevent the lead from coming in contact with the battery itself and giving the car power. I used a cloth, but you can use anything that's non-conductive. First thing we're going to do is remove the cabin air filter. This is going to be done by removing 6 8mm screws. This is where they're located. One on the left side, 2 in the front here, 1 on the right side, and then 2 up top. Once we remove those 6 screws, we can just pull the air filter off like so. So the next thing we're going to remove is this wire loom here, which has cables from the battery, which also go to the alternator as well as the starter itself. So to remove this, we're just going to carefully pull down and out. It's connected using 3 tabs here, so we're just going to carefully pull down and out. Now we have to remove this wiring here underneath. Just by pulling it out, it's clipped in as well. And we can just leave these 2 wiring looms here resting on top of the engine cover. The next step will be to remove this cowling here. This is done by removing this cover here as well as the identical one on the other side. It's held on by a clip on the front here, as well as a clip on the back. Once you remove that cover, it will expose a bolt here, as well as one on the other side. After removing this, pull this tab back here, like so, and remove this ambient air temperature sensor by twisting it and pulling it out, and remove this clip holding the wire on. Now we can just set this aside here, resting on the side of the hood here. Now we're going to remove this cowling by pulling it up and out. Don't be worried about breaking it. You may need to use some force to get it out. Now we have access to all of the manifold nuts and bolts. So we're going to remove these 11mm bolts and nuts, as well as the oil pressure sensor right here. To make our lives a little bit easier maneuvering the manifold, we're going to remove these 3 studs here using an E6 female Torx socket. After removing those studs, your manifold should be free. You may need to pry it off with a flathead if it's stuck. Now, to make more room for the manifold to come off, we're going to remove the power steering reservoir. Now don't worry, we won't have to disconnect any of the hoses. We're just going to disconnect the reservoir and push it out of the way. We're going to remove these 2 nuts using a 10mm socket. To make more room for the manifold, we'll start off by removing these 2 10mm bolts. Now we need to grab a flathead screwdriver to loosen this hose clamp and remove the airbox hose from the throttle body. Now we need to remove the snorkel, and to do so we'll loosen up these 2 T20 Torx screws on the front of the snorkel. After removing those Torx screws, we can pull the snorkel out like so and disconnect it from the airbox. Now we need to disconnect the mass airflow sensor so we can remove the airbox. Now, after removing those 2 10mm bolts, loosening the hose clamp, disconnecting the snorkel, and disconnecting the mass airflow sensor, we can pull the airbox out. It just comes out as one assembly like so. Now we're going to disconnect these 2 connectors here, allowing us to get better access to the starter. Now we can pull the manifold out of the way, and we have access to the starter. So here's the starter. Next step, we'll need to disconnect the cables connected to the starter. This nut holding on your positive battery leads on your starter is a 13mm nut. So now that you got the leads disconnected from the starter, it's time to remove the top bolt. Just to illustrate it for you here with the new starter, the top bolt is located and accessed from the back of the transmission, and you're going to loosen it by going on the other side of the manifold and going down in with an 11mm wrench. Unfortunately, the E14 female Torx socket does not get in there because it's such a tight space. To access the bottom bolt of the starter, I'm using a combination of wobble extensions going from my ratchet here down under the starter to access that E14 female Torx bolt. So once you've removed both the top and bottom bolt, you can pull out your starter, and now it's time to install the new one. Now that we've got the new starter fit in there, it's time to bolt it down. Please note you need to get replacement bolts, as the aluminum bolts are only one-time use and you cannot reuse the original ones. Alright, we've got both bolts in now, and it's time to reconnect the battery cable. Now, before reinstalling the manifold, we need to replace the manifold gaskets. Use a small flathead screwdriver to pry the gaskets out and then push the new gaskets in. After installing new manifold seals, it's time to reinstall the manifold. Now that the manifold is back in place, begin with installing the 4 11mm bolts, starting with the top left corner. I've got the bolts loosely fit on the manifold, and now it's time to reinstall the studs. Now that I've got the studs reinstalled, I can put the nuts back on them. Now we've got the nuts back on these studs and all the bolts reinstalled on the manifold. We can now start torquing them down from the middle, working our way outwards in a back and forth pattern. Now we need to reconnect our oil pressure sensor. We now need to reinstall the airbox. Move this reservoir out of the way. Make sure no sensors or wires are underneath the airbox and slide it into place. To reconnect the mass airflow sensor connector. Now reinstall the 10mm nuts holding on the power steering reservoir. At this point, all wires and crucial components should be reconnected, and it's now time to reconnect the battery and test start the vehicle. Now we need to install the covers on the right and left side of the cowling. Reinstall the ambient air temperature sensor by pushing it into place and twisting it to lock it into place. We need to reinstall the cabin air filter. Last but not least, we need to install the wire looms by snapping them back into the cowling. Now your starter replacement is complete.